Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus and his disciples set out for the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Along the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They said in reply, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter said to him in reply, "You are the Christ." Then he warned them not to tell anyone about him. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed and rise after 3 days. He spoke this openly. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. At this, he turned around and, looking at his disciples, rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking as God does, but as human beings do." He summoned the crowds with his disciples and said to them, "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and that of the gospel will save it." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Across our nation, this is a big weekend. Many football fans notice this as opening weekend for the NFL. And it's very interesting that these men, these professional athletes, train all summer long, perhaps for their whole lives, to do some very difficult things. They suffer, they throw their bodies at one another. They really tackle, and they are tackled by huge muscle-bound people. And there's a lot of suffering that they wrap up into this. They give themselves wholly to this, their whole lives, for the sake of making the team, hopefully making a contract on that team, maybe making the playoffs and winning the Super Bowl. That's their aim. That's their goal. They suffer because they're looking for a goal. They're looking for some other good. That's a pattern for life. Suffering happens, and yet sometimes it's to be endured for another good, a greater good, perhaps even a greater glory. And so football players are men of great suffering for that greater good. They know the common refrain, no pain, no gain. They suffer for that, and many others do too. Firefighters, police, servicemen and women. We remember them just yesterday, September 11th. Their sacrifice, their suffering was real for a greater good to help protect our nation. And parents are perhaps the most primary role of this in society. Of all the sacrifices, all the things that they do, they at times need to put their needs to death for the good of the other, their children, the good of their family. Again, this is a common theme that suffering, while it is painful and it is difficult, it can be endured for the sake of a greater good, a true and a greater glory that is to come. It's a common pattern, and you might even say that we can't avoid that. We can't avoid, just like we couldn't avoid taxes, we can't avoid suffering. The same is true with death. And yet they can be endured, they can be experienced in a way that is very holy, in a way that is very good at times. It's still painful, though. I mean, I can't deny that we all have very difficult experiences at times that we go through. And that's not to be taken lightly. We don't want to just look at the holiness that could come from suffering and escape, avoid the reality that for some it is so difficult. Perhaps the worst is when you suffer alone. That's like two crosses right there you're bearing simultaneously. And Jesus knows this. God permits suffering. He's not up in heaven seeking to make us squirm or trying to, none of that at all. God only allows suffering to happen for this greater good, for a true new life to come from it. And we see that because when Jesus walked on this earth, He healed people. He took them out of their suffering. He raised his friend Lazarus from the dead. Jesus knew the suffering that we all experience. And when it was for the glory of God and for the good of people, he would bring them out of that. That's a good thing. And yet, here in our journey, we do suffer. We might want Jesus to miraculously heal us. But he shows us in the gospel today the gift that suffering can be, the gift that even death itself can be. Death, something that he spoke openly about, his own death. He says that the Son of Man, him, Jesus, must suffer greatly, be rejected by those in power, have a terrible death on the cross, and then rise again on the third day. Jesus saw the full perspective, you might say. He knew that suffering was going to be a given in life. He even knew the type of suffering he was going to have to bear. And he saw the greater picture, the perspective, the horizon, that God was going to use that to bring about a miraculous and wonderful reality. And so I wish sometimes that I had that vision. I don't know if you do too. That you could maybe see the good that could come from the suffering in your life. And we'll leave that to God to reveal to us one day in heaven. But he here shows us the holiness that can come through suffering, as difficult as it is, and even death. As hard as that is to sometimes even talk about. Or we avoid that like the plague, don't we? We distract ourselves with our phones and everything else, not to think about death. But Jesus says, no, these things can be endured in a holy way, and they can lead you to the glory, the wonderfully resurrected life that I have for you. It's as if our lives we live, and we have our plans, right? I love plans. I don't know about you. I have a schedule. I try to keep it. But it's so small compared with the plans that God has for me. So I could live my whole life trying to avoid suffering, try to control everything so that it's just as I would want it. And that would be far too small for the plan that God would have for me. No, just like Jesus in the gospel, he sees so far beyond. He knows the suffering and death will be there. But he sees beyond it because it can be our path to lead us to heaven, to glory. It's a wonderful mystery, a very hard mystery when we have to bear it. But it is the truth. And so we, following Jesus, he who suffered much for love himself, coming down to earth to die, but then to rise and to put death into the grave itself. So that this whole life, with all of its difficulties, the crosses, the things that we don't even want to admit to ourselves that we have to deal with, that is what Jesus can redeem. It's going to be a process of difficulties and conversions, but he is with us. The suffering Messiah is with us, allowing us to suffer and even to die, so that at the end of our life we can look out and, God willing, be in heaven and have that perspective that he's wanted us to have all the time. To see that all of this life, with all of its difficulties and even death itself, was just like the birth canal of a newborn baby, that all of that difficult labor is for a new life, a new birth.